Hello, everybody. Mr. Parrot here for Thursday, March 11th, with your science recap of what we're doing today. In class today, we're going to be looking at the scientists who came up with the theory of natural selection by visiting a couple of islands, looking at a couple of birds and lizards, and realizing, hey, they got some similars and differences going on with them. So before we do any of that stuff and dive into our notes, bell ringer, first and foremost, make sure that you answer them up. Secondly, if we have a March Madness update, you will see that video posted in the folder for you to watch and update your brackets. Can't remember if this week was Monday, Wednesday, Friday, or Tuesday, Thursday, so just always look out to see if there's a video up there for you to get a good rundown of stuff. So without further ado, we're going to be looking at Darwin's notes and what Darwin did, which is objective number 2 with Charles Darwin and his discovery of the theory of natural selection. So, who is this Charles Darwin? Usually you'll see him depicted as this bearded man up top and to the side of me, but actually when he discovered his major idea of natural selection and his theories that go along with it, he actually was a much younger man, probably in his mid to late 20s, early 30s with it. And what he actually was is that he was a naturalist, and he was recruited to sail on the H.M.S. Beagle, which stands for Her Majesty's ship, because it was a royal expedition from the Queen herself, or King at the time, to go and basically circle the globe in search of different animals, different plants that England can use to use for their own self, whether for domesticated purposes like for cows and whatnot, or looking for different plants that could be used to make new medicines and whatnot. He was the naturalist on board, so his job was to study all of the species that they came into contact with and take notes on them if they would be good to bring back or not. This expedition lasted for 5 years because they went all the way around the world. Here's his little trip around the world. I'll move myself here real quick. Boop, boop. So you can see that little red line started up there in England, went down around South America, over across the oceans there, hit up Australia, the southern tip of Africa, before going back up to England. So going all the way around, circumnavigating the globe for that. I'll move myself back down. But what he did was that as he went from place to place, he observed that animals and plants were different in every area, because of course they're different, but they did have their similarities, and the fact that some similarities depended on the habitats that they were in. And he saw that no matter where he went, certain traits just kept on popping up. And that question, that kind of got into his head of why that would be the case. They're completely different continents, separated by oceans, but yet these animals are getting similar traits, but obviously they're different animals. So that kind of led him to thinking about what eventually came up as natural selection. So ultimately he saw 3 things that majorly impacted him. The first thing was that he collected fossils from different areas. So when he found the fossils, he looked at the fossils and realized that the fossils that were there were very similar to the animals that were alive on the different locations that he visited, but they had their slight differences. They had little tweaks made to them. They had improvements made to their design. You can see down below there's a ancient turtle compared to our tortoises that we have nowadays, and you can see how the shell's a little bit different to allow for their necks to stretch out and stuff like that. So his idea that he came up with, and his key concept, was that species vary over time and that they do change over the course of history compared to when they were fossils to now. The species themselves change. The animals themselves can change. Usually for the better, because the worse off ones are going to be the ones that die off. The second thing that he noticed, and I'm going to have to move myself again here, maybe I'll go right up here in the middle, is that he saw 3 weird birds on his journey. He saw rayas, which are right below me now. Those are from South America. He saw ostriches from Africa, and he saw emus from Australia. These birds were very unique in the fact that they're all big birds that don't really fly and have these long legs and long necks, that they have a lot of similar traits to each other, but they're clearly different birds. If you look at each one of those birds, they're obviously different. They got different feathers, different coloration, differences going in there, but they have the same general structure to them. So that got him thinking that each animal was different. So why would they have the similarities? They have the similarities because, I'm going to go back to my map here. They had the same similarities because their habitats ended up being the same. And if you look at where he visited South America, Africa, and Australia, you can see my little mouse here. I'm going to get my pointer out so it's red. If you look at all the areas that he visited, these little red dots, you can kind of tell, maybe they're on there. Sometimes there's a dot, but right along you can almost draw like a complete straight line across where he visited. They would have the same type of environment in all those places because they're the same distance away from the equator. They get the same amount of sunlight. They're in a similar habitat. So when he found the rayas in South America and the ostriches down here at the tip of Africa and the emus and his different locations that he saw in Australia, they all relatively had the same habitat, which got him to thinking that not only are species varying throughout time and that they're getting similar and different traits throughout time, but the species globally are going to have their different variations, but they also have their similarities depending on the environment that they live in. And if they live in a similar habitat and similar things, those traits that are just better are going to naturally just come into existence. So the fact that things vary globally but still have a little bit of similarity to them is a second key concept that he came up with for his theory of natural selection. His final one takes us to his ultimate area where he discovered a bunch of his major things, and that was the Galapagos Islands. Where he documented a bunch of the finches that were there. Finches are small, tiny birds. And what he found was that with the finches, that each one of them had a different beak depending on what they ate off of their island. And that the beak equated to the different foods that they eat. And he didn't find too many different beaked birds based off of, their chances of surviving there. So even though these islands were pretty close together, the Galapagos Islands, let's see if I got a picture. There we go. Here's our Galapagos Islands. So they're a little island chain here, and they're not too far distance away from each other. But even though each one of these is their own unique island, each one of them brought a slightly different habitat to it. And because they have a slightly different habitat to them, each one of the birds or the finches that were there had a different style of beak. Because on one island, they had a bunch of cactuses, or cacti. They should use proper English, cacti, for them. So the birds' beaks were adapted to eating the cacti off there, or feasting off of the bugs that lived inside the cacti. Some of the birds were on an island that had nuts that had shells around them, so they had big crunching beaks so that they could crush the shells to get to the nut that's on the inside. Other ones had little tiny beaks so that they could get in between the holes of like the trees and the wood and stuff to pick out insects out of the wood. So each beak he saw as they went from island to island, he saw was a little bit different, and they were a little bit different because of the food that they ate. So that came up with his third concept, that species not only vary across the globe, but even locally they can have their different variations, and some things can be good and some things can be bad. For his trip around the world. Now, ultimately, what he saw with the... I'm going to move my face so that I'm not in the way of the squirrels here real quick. I gotta love the squirrels in my Grand Canyon. I'm going to go boop down here. Was that he saw geographic isolation, which means that basically these organisms were separated from each other by some kind of barrier, in this case being on different islands, where they could not get to each other. The populations could not mesh together anymore, could not come back together. And another example of this, that would be more of a United States example instead of the Galapagos, is we have two different squirrel species that live in the Grand Canyon, and they're on opposite sides of the canyon. where one species has adapted a different lifestyle and a different diet because they are on one side of the canyon, and on the other side of the canyon we have a different type of squirrel that has a different set of traits because of the side of the canyon that they are on. But because they cannot get across the canyon very easily, they've adapted to being what is known as the kaibab squirrels on one side and the Abert squirrels on the other, where they are two different squirrels now, instead of being all one and the same, because they can't intermingle anymore because of that. So what really happens with the finches, kind of the breakdown of what Darwin said, is that the finches were very similar to the finches that he saw from Ecuador in South America. And at one point, he said that the finches flew to the Galapagos Islands because they had the wing to their back, allowing them to push forward towards the islands, but they could not make it back to the mainlands. So these finches had to settle on the islands. And at that time, they did not have any finches on the island, so there's a bunch of empty habitats ready for the finches to basically repopulate the area. The finches then, over time, adapt to each environment gradually over a long period of time, where the ones that were successful and had good beaks for eating the food, they were the ones that lived. Since they were the ones that lived, they passed on their genes to the next generation. The ones that had the bad beaks, so to say, that could not eat food, they ended up dying off. If you die off, you cannot pass your beak on to the next generation. So all of a sudden, we get a bunch of bird beaks coming in of different varieties and sizes, and you can see those right down below me, where on each island there was a different type of bird based off of what was there and what they had to eat on that island. So that one island, there was a fruit-eating bird. In another island, there was birds that ate all the grubs. Those are the things that before they become insects, like caterpillars and stuff. Think of like that. There's the tool-using ones, which use the needles of the cacti to poke in the cactus to get the bugs that way. There is the insect-eating bugs, the leaf-eating bugs, and then you had the giant-beaked ones that crushed the seeds to nom-nom-nom on that stuff. Whereas everything else just ended up dying off because it was not able to get food on those islands. And they couldn't go anywhere else because of geographic isolation. They were stuck on those islands. So because they were stuck, they ended up becoming dead in that case. And there you can see all the different types of birds then in the Galapagos Islands and what they ate, depending on what their beak size was. So we have now this wide variety of different birds that are on the Galapagos Islands, all of them finches, but they have one variation that is very important for them, and that is their beak, because of the competition that was driven from having a lack of food at each one of the islands. Each island had a different type of food resource. He also looked at things like iguanas and other types of lizards, because on each island he also noticed that there's different iguanas. There was marine iguanas, and there are land iguanas, and there are iguanas that blended in with the grass, and there's iguanas that blended in with the wood, and iguanas that blended in with the sand, and it all really depended on where those iguanas were. And I mention iguanas because your homework tonight is going to be reading a story about these iguanas nowadays and kind of what some of the scientists are doing with those iguanas. So here's a video kind of detailing through what Darwin said. But let's go ahead and open up Schoology to look at your assignment here. It is called Operation Iguana. So we're going to pull that up. And it's going to be an article about what scientists are doing at the Galapagos Islands now with those same species that Darwin interacted with so long ago. So you can start things up on there, and all you got to do is just read through each one of the sections and answer the questions that follow. Each one of them has somewhere between 3 to 4 questions on it, depending on what it was. So there's five basically chunks of this article to look at, detailing what they're doing with these iguanas and how they basically saved spoilers, they save an iguana species from going completely extinct from these islands, which is a pretty cool thing that people have done because we like to have that biodiversity on this planet, which means we want to have a variety of different animals that live here on Earth. So you can submit that up. You got 2 attempts per usual with that. If you have any issues at all with any of that stuff, let me know. Otherwise, that is your assignment for tonight. That goes along with Darwin. It'll mention some of Darwin's journey stuff in there as well and make reference to him. But that is your assignment. Hope you're doing well, staying safe. Hope to see you back here tomorrow because we got a lab coming up for you tomorrow. But otherwise, I will see you later. Bye.